Do you know how American veterans perceive the phrase shouted by our volunteer soldiers, "Fire at me"? Many years after the Korean War, in a park in the United States, an American veteran who had participated in the war, sitting in a wheelchair, met a tourist from China. He asked the Chinese tourist, "May I ask you a question that has been buried in my heart for many years?" The Chinese tourist nodded and replied, "No problem. If I can help, I'll do my best to answer." The American veteran began. It was in 1953 on the Korean battlefield. My unit was ordered to attack a hill held by Chinese troops. After several rounds of artillery fire, we finally captured the position. When we got to the hilltop, there was only one very young Chinese soldier still alive. He glared at us fiercely and shouted something into his radio, something like "Kwanli, Kwanli." But then, after my teammates fired several shots at him, artillery shells suddenly rained down on us. Of the more than 100 soldiers in my unit, only 3 of us survived, and I lost a leg in the process. For over 60 years, I've often dreamed about that battle filled with death. But my Chinese friend, I've never understood, in his final moments, why did that Chinese soldier keep yelling "Kwanli"? What does it mean? It turns out that this American veteran was Mike O'Callahan, a former governor of Nevada. Even after rebuilding his life after the war, the events of that battle had haunted him. After listening to the story, the Chinese tourist was already in tears. He responded, slowly and firmly, "You need to know this. What our soldier shouted was not Kwanli. He wasn't yelling about rights. He was shouting 'Fire at me.'" You misheard the Chinese phrase "Kai Pao" as the English word rights. O'Callahan was deeply shocked. The burden he had carried in his heart for decades was finally lifted. It turns out that the young Chinese soldier had called in his own coordinates for artillery fire, sacrificing himself to ensure the enemy would be destroyed along with him. That young soldier's name was Yu Shu Chang. According to the records of our volunteer forces, his full transmission was, "Commander, my position has been surrounded. Quickly, fire at my position. Fire at me." Immediately after the transmission, he shouted, "I'm surrounded. Long live the motherland. Fire at me. Fire at me." Then, Yu Shu Chang pulled the pin on his last grenade. The ensuing artillery fire engulfed him and the enemy, taking them both down. He was only 22 years old. Now, do you know the name of another hero who also shouted, "Fire at me"?